I've always believed in the quiet strength of routine. My name is Daniel Harper, a 38-year-old architect living in a modest suburban home in Portland, Oregon, with my wife, Emily. She's 35, a freelance graphic designer with a laugh that could light up a room and eyes that seem to hold secrets I'd never quite decipher. We've been married for 9 years, together for 12, and I thought I knew her better than I knew myself. Our life wasn't perfect, whose is? But it was ours. Mornings with coffee on the porch, evenings debating whether to order Thai or Italian, and weekends sketching blueprints or tweaking her latest design project side by side. It was a rhythm I trusted. Emily had always been the spontaneous one, the spark to my steady flame. She dragged me to art galleries or impromptu road trips, her energy a whirlwind I'd learned to adore. Lately, though, she'd been different, distant. Her phone buzzed more often, and she'd tilt the screen away with a casual smile, saying it was just a client. I didn't press her. Trust, I told myself, was the foundation we'd built. But foundations crack, don't they? You don't notice until the whole house tilts. It started with small things. She'd leave the room to take calls, her voice a low murmur I couldn't catch. She'd come home later from meetings, her hair slightly mussed, her cheeks flushed in a way I hadn't seen in years. I'd ask how her day went, and she'd shrug, her answers vague. Colors without a canvas. "Oh, you know, the usual chaos," she'd say, brushing past me to pour a glass of wine. I'd nod, swallowing the unease that gnawed at me like a splinter under a fingernail. Then there was the night I found the receipt. It slipped out of her coat pocket when I hung it up after she'd stumbled in at midnight, claiming a deadline had kept her late. A dinner for two at La Belle Étoile, a French place downtown we'd never been to together. $68 for wine, $40 for entrees. I stood there, staring at the crumpled paper, my pulse a dull thud in my ears. She didn't drink white wine with me anymore, said it gave her headaches. But here it was, plain as day Sauvignon Blanc. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I folded the receipt and tucked it into my wallet, a silent promise to myself that I'd watch closer. The next week, I became a man I didn't recognize. I checked her laptop when she was in the shower, her password still our anniversary date. Her inbox was a maze of deleted threads, but one name stood out. Marcus. No last name, just Marcus, in a draft email she hadn't sent. "Can't stop thinking about last night," it read. My stomach twisted, a cold weight settling there. Marcus. Who was he? A client? A friend? I didn't know any Marcus. I closed the laptop, my hands shaking, and sat in the dark until she came out, towel-wrapped and humming, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. I started piecing it together. The late nights, the phone, the wine. Emily was slipping away, and I was the fool who hadn't seen it. I loved her. God, I loved her. But love doesn't blind you to betrayal. It sharpens the edges. I decided then, I'd find out who Marcus was. I'd follow her if I had to. And when I knew the truth, I'd decide what came next. Not divorce, not yet. Something else. Something she'd never see coming. The first time I followed Emily, I felt like a stranger in my own skin. It was a Tuesday evening, the sky bruised with clouds, and she'd told me she was meeting a client at a coffee shop downtown. "Don't wait up," she'd said, kissing my cheek with lips that tasted faintly of peppermint. I nodded, playing the part of the trusting husband, but as soon as her car pulled out, I grabbed my keys. My Toyota hummed quietly behind hers, keeping a block's distance, my headlights off until I hit the main road. She didn't go to the coffee shop. Instead, she drove past the neon-lit strip of cafes and boutiques, turning into a residential area I didn't recognize. My grip tightened on the wheel as her taillights flickered through the streets, finally stopping outside a sleek, modern house with floor-to-ceiling windows. A man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair catching the porch light. He wore a tailored jacket, the kind I'd never owned, and when Emily climbed out of her car, he pulled her into an embrace that lasted too long. My chest burned. This was Marcus, I knew it. They disappeared inside, the door clicking shut like a guillotine on my sanity. I parked across the street, hidden by a row of pines, and waited. Hours ticked by, the windows glowing with warm light, silhouettes moving behind the glass. I imagined her laughing with him, her head tilted back the way it used to with me. I imagined her hands on him, her voice soft and intimate in ways I hadn't heard in months. My nails dug into my palms, leaving crescent marks I'd find later. At 11:47 p.m., she emerged, her coat draped over her arm, her hair tousled. He leaned down, kissed her. A slow, deliberate thing, and she smiled up at him before slipping into her car. I ducked as she drove past, her headlights sweeping over my windshield. When I got home, she was already in bed, pretending to sleep. I stood in the doorway, watching her chest rise and fall, and wondered how she could lie so easily. The receipt, the email, the house, it all clicked into place. Marcus wasn't a client. He was her secret. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my desk, Googling the address. Public records showed it belonged to Marcus Everett, 41, a real estate developer with a LinkedIn profile dripping with arrogance. His photo showed a sharp jawline, a smug grin, and eyes that looked right through you. I stared at it until my vision blurred, memorizing every detail. Emily's lover had a face now, a name, a life I could unravel. The next day, I called in sick and drove to his office, a glass tower in the business district. I didn't go in, just watched from my car as he strode out for lunch, laughing with a colleague. He moved like he owned the world, and maybe he did. Maybe Emily was part of that world now. I followed him to a bistro, noting the way he tipped the waiter with a flourish, the way he checked his phone every few minutes. Was he texting her? Planning their next meeting? I didn't know yet, but I would. I'd learn everything about him, his habits, his weaknesses, his pride. And then I'd use it. Knowledge is a weapon, and I wielded it like a blade I was still learning to sharpen. Over the next 2 weeks, I became Marcus Everett's shadow. I tracked his routines with the precision of an architect drafting a blueprint. He left his house at 7:30 a.m. every weekday, drove a black Audi to his office, and spent his lunch hour at upscale spots downtown. Twice, I saw Emily's car parked near his building, though I never caught them together there. At night, he'd hit a gym or a bar, always with that same swagger, like the universe bent to his will. Emily, meanwhile, played her role at home with chilling ease. She'd cook dinner, pasta with marinara, my favorite, and chatter about her day, weaving lies so seamlessly I almost believed them. The client loved my mock-ups, she'd say, twirling her fork, her eyes avoiding mine. I'd smile, nod, and choke down the food, tasting nothing but ash. Every touch, every word from her felt like a performance now, and I was the audience she didn't know was booing. I dug deeper into Marcus. His social media was a curated shrine to himself. Photos of luxury cars, vacation villas, and charity galas where he posed with Portland's elite. He'd been married once, divorced 5 years ago, no kids. His ex-wife's posts hinted at infidelity, though she never named him outright. I found his gym membership through a stray Instagram story, his favorite coffee order, black, no sugar, from a barista's tweet. I even tracked down his dry cleaner, a small place where he dropped off suits every Thursday. Piece by piece, I built a map of his life. Then came the breakthrough. Late one night, I borrowed Emily's phone while she slept, her passcode still unchanged. Her texts with Marcus were buried in a thread labeled work stuff. A cruel irony. Missed you today, he'd written that morning. Tomorrow night? Her reply, can't wait. Daniel's got a late meeting. My meeting. She'd planned around me. I scrolled further, my breath shallow, and found photos. Nothing explicit, but intimate. Her in a dress I didn't recognize. Him beside her at a rooftop bar. Their smiles conspiratorial. I forwarded everything to myself and deleted the evidence. The next day, I called a friend from college, Jake, who'd gone into private investigation after a stint in security. I didn't tell him everything, just that I needed dirt on a guy named Marcus Everett. Anything you can find, I said. Business deals, habits, skeletons. Jake didn't ask questions. He knew my tone meant trouble. 2 days later, he emailed me a dossier. Marcus had a gambling habit, high-stakes poker at an underground club, and a reputation for cutting corners on development projects. Nothing illegal enough for jail, but enough to ruin him if it got out. I sat with that knowledge, letting it simmer. Emily thought she'd hidden her tracks, and Marcus thought he was untouchable. They were wrong. I wasn't ready to strike yet. I needed more. I needed to see them together again, to feel the betrayal in my bones before I turned it back on them. So I waited, a predator in the skin of a husband, plotting a revenge they'd never forget. Seeing them together again was like pouring salt into a wound I'd already carved open. It was a Friday night, and Emily had told me she was grabbing drinks with an old college friend, Sarah. I knew Sarah hadn't been in town for months. Her Instagram showed her hiking in Colorado, so I followed Emily again. This time, she drove to a boutique hotel on the edge of the city, its neon sign flickering like a warning. I parked in the shadows and watched as Marcus met her in the lobby, his hand brushing her lower back as they headed to the bar. I slipped inside after them, keeping my distance, my cap pulled low. The bar was dim, all velvet booths and jazz humming from hidden speakers. They sat in a corner, their knees touching under the table, her fingers tracing the rim of a wine glass while he leaned in, whispering something that made her laugh. It was the laugh I'd fallen for years ago, now twisted into a dagger aimed at me. I ordered a whiskey I didn't drink, my eyes locked on them, cataloging every gesture, every glance. They didn't stay long. After an hour, they paid, his card I noted, and walked to the elevator, her arm looped through his. I followed at a crawl, taking the stairs to the third floor where the elevator stopped. I peeked down the hall just in time to see them vanish into room 312, the door shutting with a soft thud. I stood there, my breath ragged, imagining what was happening behind that door. The intimacy I'd lost, handed over to a man who didn't deserve it. I didn't barge in. I didn't need to. The truth was a weight I carried now, heavy enough to crush them both when the time came. Back home, I pored over Jake's dossier again. Marcus's poker games were hosted by a guy named Tony Russo, a small-time operator with a rap sheet for tax evasion. I found Tony's number through a burner phone Jake had traced, and on a whim, I called. "I've got info on Marcus Everett," I said, keeping my voice low. "Debts he owes you." Tony grunted, interested but wary. "Meet me tomorrow," he said. "Bring proof." I didn't have proof yet, but I'd get it. Marcus's pride would be his downfall. Emily came home at 2 a.m., smelling of lavender and lies. "Sarah's doing great," she said, slipping into bed beside me. I mumbled something vague, my mind already elsewhere. The next day, I met Tony at a dive bar, a folder of fabricated receipts in hand, gambling losses I'd mocked up based on Jake's intel. "He's into you for 20 grand. I lied, sliding the papers across. Tony's eyes narrowed, but he bought it. "I'll handle him," he said. I didn't care how. I just needed Marcus rattled. That night, I watched Emily text Marcus from the couch, her thumbs flying. "He's freaking out," she typed. "Some guy's after him." His reply, "Don't worry, I'll fix it." I smiled to myself. The cracks were forming. The plan took shape like a building rising from a foundation of rage. I wasn't just going to expose them. I was going to dismantle their lives, brick by brick, until they had nothing left to hold on to. Marcus's gambling debt was the first domino. Tony had already started hounding him. I saw it in the way Marcus's car peeled out of his driveway the next day, his phone pressed to his ear, his face tight with panic. Emily noticed too. She came home distracted, her usual chatter replaced by silence, her eyes darting to her phone every few minutes. I played dumb, asking if she was okay. "Just stressed," she said, forcing a smile. "Work stuff." I nodded, letting her think I was still the oblivious husband. But I wasn't done digging. I hacked into Marcus's email. His password was laughably simple, his birthday, and found a thread with a contractor named Vince. They'd skimmed materials from a condo project, pocketing the difference. It wasn't enough for a lawsuit, but it was enough to leak to the right people. I sent an anonymous tip to a local journalist, a guy I'd met at a networking event years ago, attaching screenshots. Check out Marcus Everett, I wrote. Shady deals. The story hit online 2 days later. Developer accused of cutting corners. Marcus's phone must have blown up, because Emily spent the next evening pacing our kitchen, muttering about misunderstandings. She didn't suspect me. Not yet. But I saw the strain in her shoulders, the way she bit her lip like she used to when we fought. I offered her tea, my voice calm, and she took it with trembling hands. "It'll blow over," I said, knowing it wouldn't. Meanwhile, I turned to her. Emily's freelance career depended on her reputation. Her clients a mix of small businesses and artsy types who valued trust. I created a fake email account and sent a mass message to her contact list, posing as a disgruntled client. Emily Harper missed deadlines and overcharged me. It read, with doctored invoices attached. Within hours, her inbox was flooded with replies. Some sympathetic, some furious. She spent the next day on damage control, her voice cracking as she reassured people it was a mistake. I watched from my office, pretending to work, my heart cold but steady. By the end of the week, Marcus was a mess. Tony's goons had slashed his tires, and the article had spooked his investors. Emily was unraveling too, her career teetering, her affair a lifeline she didn't realize was fraying. I hadn't confronted her yet. That would come later, when the ground beneath them was ash. For now, I tightened the noose, step by calculated step, savoring the chaos I'd sown. The air in our house grew thick with unspoken tension, a fog I could almost taste. Emily's once bright energy had dimmed, her days consumed by frantic calls to clients and hushed conversations with Marcus I wasn't supposed to hear. I'd catch fragments. "It's getting worse," she'd whisper into her phone, pacing the backyard while I watched from the kitchen window, a shadow against the dusk. She thought I was clueless, still the architect hunched over blueprints, oblivious to the cracks in our life. But I saw everything. Marcus's world was crumbling faster than I'd expected. The journalist's article had sparked a feeding frenzy. Blogs picked it up, clients pulled funding, and whispers of an audit circled like vultures. Tony's pressure didn't help. I'd heard through Jake that Marcus had missed a payment, and Tony's patience was thin. I'd planted that seed, and now it was blooming into chaos. Emily felt it too. She'd come home pale, her hands fidgeting, her excuses flimsier each time. "A friend's having a rough patch," she'd say, avoiding my eyes. I'd nod, playing my part, but inside I was a furnace, stoking the flames. I decided to tighten the screws. Marcus's gym was my next target, a high-end place with saunas and personal trainers, a status symbol he flaunted online. I joined a week earlier under a fake name, blending into the crowd of sweat-soaked egos. He was there every Tuesday and Friday, lifting weights with a scowl, his bravado slipping. I waited until he hit the locker room, then slipped a note into his bag while he showered. "I know what you did with Vince," it read and signed. When he found it, his face went white, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. I watched from across the room, towel over my shoulder, invisible to him. Emily came home that night rattled, her coat still on as she poured herself a glass of wine with shaky hands. "Something weird's happening," she said, more to herself than me. "Marcus thinks someone's out to get him." I raised an eyebrow, feigning concern. "That sounds rough. Any idea who?" She shook her head, sipping too fast, and I let the silence hang, heavy as lead. She didn't suspect me. Not yet. But I could see the doubt creeping in, a splinter in her perfect lie. I wasn't done with her either. Her freelance career was already wobbling from my fake client email. But I wanted more. I found her portfolio site, a sleek page she'd spent months designing, and hacked it with a trick Jake had taught me years ago. Basic SQL injection, child's play for someone with my patience. I replaced her glowing testimonials with scathing reviews, forged complaints about missed deadlines and unprofessional behavior. By morning, her phone was buzzing with panicked clients, her voice rising as she tried to explain. "It's a glitch," she insisted, tears in her eyes. I offered a sympathetic shrug from the doorway, my coffee mug hiding my smirk. That evening, I drove by Marcus's house again. His Audi was gone, replaced by a tow truck hauling it away. Tony's work, I assumed. The lights were off, the place eerily still. I wondered if he'd told Emily yet, if she knew how deep he was sinking. I didn't care. They'd built their little world behind my back, and now I was tearing it down, plank by plank. The revenge wasn't loud, not yet. It was a slow burn, a structure collapsing under its own weight, and I was the architect of its ruin. Time became a tool I wielded with precision. Each day a brick in the wall I was building around them. Emily's unraveling was subtle but relentless. She'd stopped cooking, stopped humming, stopped pretending everything was fine. Her laptop sat open on the dining table, a battlefield of unanswered emails and frantic apologies to clients who'd already moved on. "I don't understand," she'd mutter, rubbing her temples. "It's like someone's targeting me." I'd murmur something vague. "Bad luck, maybe?" And watch her spiral, her confidence eroding like sand in a storm. Marcus was worse off. Jake sent me updates. The audit had started, his company's books a mess of discrepancies he couldn't explain. Tony had escalated too. Marcus's office had been vandalized, windows smashed, files strewn across the floor. I didn't feel sorry for him. He'd taken something from me, something sacred, and now he was paying in pieces. I saw him once, leaving his gym, his shoulders slumped, his phone pressed to his ear. He looked smaller, diminished, a king stripped of his crown. I decided to push Emily further. She'd always prided herself on her art, her designs a lifeline to her identity. I found a local gallery where she'd showcased a piece last year, a vibrant abstract she'd poured months into. Posing as a concerned buyer, I called the owner, a chatty woman named Claire, and spun a tale. I heard Emily Harper's work was stolen from another artist. I'd hate to invest in a fraud. Claire's tone shifted, her curiosity piqued. "I'll look into it," she promised. Word spread fast in Portland's tight-knit art scene. By the next day, Emily's phone lit up with texts from friends, their questions sharp and accusing. She cried in the bathroom that night, the door locked, thinking I couldn't hear. I wasn't satisfied. Marcus needed another hit, something personal. His divorce had left scars. I'd read his ex-wife's blog, her veiled jabs at his ego. I tracked her down on Facebook, a woman named Rachel living in Seattle, and sent her a message from a burner account. "Marcus is at it again," I wrote, attaching a photo of him and Emily from their rooftop date. "Thought you'd want to know." Rachel didn't reply, but 2 days later, Marcus's Instagram was flooded with cryptic comments. "Karma's a beast. Some things never change." His followers piled on, speculation buzzing like flies. He deleted the post, but the damage was done. Emily felt the ripple. "Marcus is losing it," she told me over breakfast, her voice brittle. "He thinks his ex is behind all this." I stirred my coffee, hiding the thrill that surged through me. "Sounds messy," I said. She nodded, oblivious to the puppet strings I held. That night, I overheard her on the phone with him, their voices tense. "We need to stop," she said. "It's too much." He argued, pleaded, but she hung up, her face a mask of exhaustion. I almost pitied her, almost. The next morning, I mailed an anonymous package to Marcus's office. A USB drive with audio I'd fabricated, his voice, badly mimicked but convincing, bragging about the condo scam to Vince. I'd spent hours piecing it together, layering background noise from a bar to sell it. If the auditors found it, he'd be finished. I didn't know if they would, but the fear alone would eat him alive. I leaned back in my chair, the house silent around me, and pictured their panic. It wasn't enough yet. I wanted them broken, not just bruised. The cracks in their facade widened, and I reveled in the chaos I'd sown. Emily's career was a ghost of itself. Clients gone. Her portfolio site a graveyard of fake reviews she couldn't erase. She'd taken to staring out the window for hours, her sketchpad untouched, her spirit hollowed out. "I don't know who I am anymore," she said one night, her voice small. I sat across from her, flipping through a magazine I wasn't reading, and offered a bland, "You'll figure it out." She didn't see the venom behind my calm, didn't know I was the storm tearing her apart. Marcus was a shell too. The USB drive had landed. I saw it in the way his LinkedIn went quiet, his smug updates replaced by absence. Jake told me the auditors had called him in for questioning, and Tony's goons had roughed him up outside a bar, leaving him limping. His house went up for sale. A for sale sign stabbed into the lawn like a surrender flag. I drove by to see it, the windows dark, the arrogance drained from the place. He'd lost his kingdom and Emily was next. I turned my attention to her social circle. She'd always leaned on her friends, artsy types who'd gush over her talent, prop her up when she faltered. I created a dozen fake profiles on X, each one a different persona, and started posting. Emily Harper's a fraud, one wrote, linking to her hacked site. Stole my design, another claimed, uploading a doctored image I'd mocked up. The post spread, her friends tagged, their replies shifting from defense to doubt. She noticed when her phone chimed with a text from her best friend. Lena, what's going on, Em? People are talking. Emily's face crumpled, and she didn't answer. I wasn't done with Marcus. His gambling habit was a thread I hadn't fully pulled. I called Tony again, this time with a new lie. Marcus bragged about stiffing you. Said you're too soft to do anything. Tony's laugh was cold. We'll see about that. The next day, Jake texted me a photo. Marcus's Audi, windows smashed, parked crookedly outside his gym. I didn't know what Tony had done, but I could guess. Marcus was a marked man now, his allies shrinking by the hour. Emily tried to reach him. I saw the calls she made when she thought I was asleep, her voice desperate. Pick up, please, she'd whisper. But he didn't. She didn't know he was drowning, didn't know I'd tied the weights to his ankles. She came to me instead, fragile and lost. I think I've messed up, she said, sitting on the couch, her knees drawn up. Everything's falling apart. I looked at her, my wife, my betrayer, and felt nothing but the cold edge of my plan. Sometimes things have to break, I said, my tone flat. She nodded, missing the threat. That night, I finalized the next step. Emily's car, a silver Honda she loved, was her last tether to normalcy. I'd watched her polish it, sing in it, escape in it to him. I waited until she slept, then slipped outside with a screwdriver and a can of paint thinner from the garage. I scratched faint lines into the hood, random, jagged, then poured the thinner over the seats through a cracked window. By morning, the interior reeked, the leather ruined. She found it at dawn, her scream piercing the quiet. Who would do this? She sobbed. I stood beside her, hands in my pockets, and shrugged. Kids, maybe. She didn't buy it, but she didn't suspect me either. Not yet. The house felt like a battlefield now. Silent but charged. Every glance between us a skirmish, she didn't know we were fighting. Emily's despair was palpable. She'd stopped leaving the house, her phone a lifeline she clutched like a drowning woman. Her friends had drifted, her clients were gone, and her car was a wreck she couldn't afford to fix. I'm cursed, she said one morning, her coffee untouched, her eyes red-rimmed. I watched her from the kitchen counter, slicing an apple with slow, deliberate cuts, and said nothing. She didn't deserve my comfort. Marcus was a ghost. His house sold at a loss. His company teetered on bankruptcy. And Tony's shadow loomed larger every day. I'd heard he'd skipped town, leaving debts and enemies behind, but I wasn't sure. I didn't care where he went, only that he'd lost everything. I'd stripped him bare, and now Emily was next. She still didn't know I knew about them, still thought her secrets were safe. That ignorance was my leverage, a blade I'd plunge when the moment was right. I turned to her past. She'd grown up in Eugene, a small town where her parents still lived, proud of their artsy daughter. I called her mother, Diane, from a blocked number, my voice disguised with a cheap app. Emily's in trouble, I said, low and urgent. She's mixed up with a bad guy, owes money she can't pay. Diane gasped, her questions tumbling out, but I hung up before she could press. Hours later, Emily's phone rang. Her mom, voice shrill through the speaker. What's going on, Emily? Who's this man? Emily stammered, caught off guard, her lies tangling. It's nothing, Mom. A misunderstanding. But Diane didn't believe her. The call ended with tears on both sides. Another thread snapped. I didn't stop there. Emily's college mentor, a professor named Carla, had been her rock, a reference she still leaned on. I emailed Carla from a spoofed address, posing as a colleague. Heard Emily's been passing off student work as hers. I wrote, attaching a vague but damning file. Carla's reply was curt. I'll need to verify this. Emily got the call 2 days later, her face paling as she listened. No, that's not true, she insisted. But the damage was done. Carla's trust, once ironclad, wavered. Emily threw her phone across the room, its screen cracking on the hardwood. Marcus surfaced briefly. A text to Emily I intercepted when she left her phone on the counter. I'm sorry, it read. I can't do this anymore. She didn't see it. I deleted it before she could, then blocked his number. Let her think he'd abandoned her without a word. She'd call him later, confused, hurt, and get nothing but silence. I wanted her isolated, every lifeline severed, until she had only me to turn to, and then I'd pull that away too. That night, I took her wedding ring. She'd left it on the bathroom sink, a habit from our early years when she'd wash dishes and forget to put it back on. I melted it in the garage with a blowtorch I'd bought months ago for a project, the gold pooling into a useless lump. I left it on her pillow, a twisted relic of what we'd been. She found it at midnight, her gasp waking me, or so she thought. Daniel, what happened? She whispered, holding the ruined ring. I blinked, feigning sleepiness. No idea. Where'd you leave it? She didn't answer, just stared at it, her world shrinking smaller still. The endgame loomed, a horizon I could finally see. Emily was a shadow of herself, her laughter gone, her spirit crushed under the weight of a life I'd dismantled. She'd stopped fighting the rumors, stopped calling Marcus, stopped pretending. I think I need help, she told me one evening, her voice barely audible over the hum of the TV. She sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes hollow. I don't know what's happening to me. I looked at her, my wife, my traitor, and felt the cold satisfaction of a plan nearing its peak. We'll figure it out. I lied, my tone soft as a trap. Marcus was finished, I confirmed it through Jake. He'd fled to California, hiding from Tony and the auditors, his name a punchline in Portland's business circles. His empire was ash, his pride dust. I didn't need to touch him anymore. He'd buried himself. But Emily, she was still here, still mine to break. I'd taken her career, her friends, her family's trust, her car, her ring. Now I'd take her sanity, her last fragile thread, and snap it clean. I started small. I moved things, her keys, her sketchbook, her favorite mug, leaving them in odd places. The freezer, the attic, under the sink. She'd find them, frown, and mutter, I'm losing my mind. I'd shrug, casual as ever. Maybe you're just tired. Then I escalated. I recorded whispers. My voice, distorted, muttering nonsense, and played them faintly through a Bluetooth speaker hidden in the guest room. She'd wake up, startled, asking if I'd heard something. Just the wind, I'd say, watching her doubt herself grow. I mailed her letters, typed and unsigned, delivered to our mailbox in plain envelopes. You're not fooling anyone, the first read. We see you, said the second. She'd open them at the table, her hands trembling, her breath shallow. Who's doing this? She'd ask, showing me the paper. I'd scan it, feign alarm. Maybe a prank. Should we call someone? She'd shake her head, too shaken to act. The third letter was a photo of her and Marcus at that rooftop bar, grainy but unmistakable. Liar, it said in red ink. She dropped it, her face ashen, and didn't speak for hours. I pushed harder. I called her from a burner phone, late at night, breathing heavily before hanging up. She checked the number, untraceable, and clutched the blanket tighter. Someone's watching me, she whispered, her voice cracking. I'd hold her, my arms a cage, and murmur, it's okay. While knowing it wasn't, she stopped sleeping, her eyes ringed with shadows, her steps unsteady. The whispers, the letters, the calls. They wore her down. A siege on her mind I'd orchestrated with surgical care. By week's end, she was a wreck. She'd sit by the window, staring at nothing, jumping at every sound. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice a thread. I nodded, my face a mask of concern, and suggested a therapist. "Maybe they can help," I said, knowing she'd never go. She was too afraid to leave the house. That night, I left a final note on the kitchen counter. "Confess, or it gets worse." She found it at dawn, her scream raw, and turned to me, eyes wild. "Daniel, what's happening?" I stepped closer, my moment near, and said, "Maybe it's time you told me the truth." Emily stood there, the note trembling in her hand, her eyes locked on mine like a deer caught in headlights. "What truth?" she whispered, her voice fragile, fraying at the edges. I tilted my head, letting the silence stretch, a predator savoring the moment before the strike. "You tell me," I said, my tone even, almost gentle. She flinched, the paper slipping to the floor, and for the first time I saw it, real fear, not just confusion. She knew something was wrong, but she didn't know how deep the hole was. Not yet. I'd spent months building this trap, weaving a web so tight she'd never escape. Her career was ashes, her friends ghosts, her family distant, her mind a battlefield I'd turned against her. The whispers, the letters, the calls. They'd chipped away at her, leaving a shell I could shatter with a single push. "Daniel," she said, stepping back, "you're scaring me." I smiled, small and cold. "Good." Her breath hitched, and she sank into a chair, her hands clutching her knees. "What's going on?" she asked again, weaker now. I didn't answer, not with words. Instead, I pulled out my phone and opened the photos I'd forwarded from hers months ago. Her and Marcus, laughing on that rooftop, his arm around her like she was his. I slid the device across the table, the screen glowing between us. She stared at it, her face draining of color, her mouth opening but no sound coming out. "How long?" I asked, my voice low, steady. She shook her head, tears welling. "It's not, Daniel, I cut her off. "Don't lie. Not now." She broke then, sobs racking her body, her hands covering her face. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "It was a mistake. Marcus, he made me feel. I didn't care why. I didn't want her excuses." I leaned forward, my shadow falling over her. "You chose him," I said, "and I chose this." Her head snapped up, confusion cutting through the tears. "Chose what?" I stood, walking to my desk, and returned with a folder, printouts of her emails, his LinkedIn, the article, the fake reviews, everything. I dropped it in her lap. "Read it." She flipped through the pages, her hands shaking, her breath ragged. "You did this?" she whispered, realization dawning. "The clients, the car, the ring. All of it?" I nodded, watching her world collapse. "You betrayed me, Emily, so I took everything from you. And him." She stared at me, a stranger in her husband's skin, and I saw the moment she understood. This wasn't forgiveness. This was war. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. I leaned in close, my words a blade. "Because you deserved it." She didn't fight back, not yet. She just sat there, the folder spilling onto the floor, her sobs filling the room. I let her cry, let her feel the weight of what I'd done. It wasn't over. The confession was just the beginning, the key to the final act. I'd stripped her bare, but I wanted her to carry the ruin, to live with it long after I was gone. Marcus was next on my list, a loose end I'd tie off with the same precision. I turned away, leaving her there, and started planning the end. Marcus had vanished, but I wasn't done with him. He'd slunk off to California, thinking distance could save him, but I had eyes everywhere. Jake, Tony, even Rachel, his ex, who'd unknowingly become my ally. I tracked him through a tip from Jake. A cheap motel in Sacramento, paid for with a credit card he'd maxed out. He was broke, broken, a king reduced to a pauper. I could have left him there, let him rot in his own mess, but that wasn't enough. He'd touched what was mine, and I wanted him to feel it. I called Tony one last time. "Marcus is in Sacramento," I said, rattling off the motel's address. He's got nothing left, but he's still laughing at you. Tony didn't ask questions, just grunted, I'll take care of it. I didn't know what he'd do, didn't care. A beating, a threat, a final shove into the abyss. It didn't matter. Marcus would pay and Emily would hear about it. I wanted her to know her lover was as ruined as she was, a mirror to her own fall. Back home, Emily was a ghost. She'd stopped crying, stopped talking, just drifted through the house like a specter. The folder sat untouched on the table, a silent accusation. I didn't push her, not yet. I let her stew, let the guilt and fear fester. She'd try to leave soon. I knew it, but I'd planned for that. Her car was useless, her bank account, joint with mine, drained into a new one she couldn't access. I'd moved half our savings months ago, a precaution she'd never noticed. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. She was mine to finish. I started the next phase. I called her parents again, this time as myself. Emily's been lying to you, I said, my voice calm, measured. She had an affair. It's why everything's falling apart. Diane gasped, her husband muttering in the background. We're coming up, she said. I hung up, knowing they'd arrive to a daughter they wouldn't recognize. A story they'd never unhear. Then I emailed Lena, her best friend, attaching the rooftop photo. She's not who you think, I wrote. Lena's reply was instant. I need space from this. Another thread cut. Emily found out that night. Her phone buzzed, her mom, furious, demanding answers. She listened, pale and silent, then hung up and turned to me. You told them? Her voice was a rasp. I nodded. They deserved the truth. She lunged at me then, her fists weak against my chest, her screams raw. You're a monster. I grabbed her wrists, held her still. You made me one, I said, and let her go. She crumpled, defeated, and I walked away, the house echoing with her despair. The next day, I mailed Marcus a package, photos of him and Emily, the USB drive, a note. You thought you'd win. No return address, just a ghost from his past to haunt him. Tony's call came that night. He's handled. I didn't ask details. It was done. Emily's lover was a memory, and she was next. Emily's parents arrived at noon, their rental car crunching gravel in our driveway. I watched from the porch as Diane stormed out, her face a mask of betrayal, her husband trailing behind, quieter but stern. Emily met them at the door, her hair unwashed, her eyes swollen. Mom, I can explain, she started, but Diane cut her off. You lied to us, Emily. An affair? With some sleazy developer. Emily flinched, glancing at me, and I stood there, arms crossed, silent. They didn't know I'd orchestrated the rest. Just the betrayal, the part that hurt them most. The argument spilled inside, voices rising and falling like a tide. We raised you better, her father said, his disappointment sharper than Diane's anger. Emily tried to defend herself, her words stumbling over tears. It was a mistake, I swear. But they weren't buying it. I stepped in, playing the wounded husband. She hid it for months, I said, my voice steady. I found out the hard way. Diane turned to me, her eyes softening. We're so sorry, Daniel. I nodded, accepting their pity, while Emily stared at me, realization sinking deeper. They left after an hour, refusing to stay, their goodbye curt. Get help, Diane said to Emily, her tone final. The door shut, and Emily turned to me, her face a storm. You're destroying me, she whispered. I met her gaze, unflinching. You destroyed us first. She didn't argue, just sank to the floor, her hands in her hair, a woman unmoored. I left her there, my plan ticking forward, relentless as a clock. That night, I staged the final blow. I'd kept one ace up my sleeve. A video from the hotel bar, grainy footage I'd bribed a bartender to pull months ago. Emily and Marcus, laughing, touching, oblivious. I uploaded it to X from a fake account, tagging her old art friends, her clients, anyone who'd listen. Emily Harper's True Colors, I captioned it. By morning, it had spread. Comments piling up, shock and disgust from people she'd once charmed. Her phone lit up, then went silent as she turned it off, her last lifeline severed. She confronted me at dawn, the video playing on her cracked screen. "This is you too, isn't it?" she asked, her voice hollow. I didn't deny it. "You wanted him," I said. "Now everyone knows." She threw the phone at me, missing by inches, and screamed. A sound that tore through the house, primal and lost. I didn't flinch. "You can't undo it," I said, and walked out, leaving her to drown in the wreckage. The day passed in silence. She didn't eat, didn't move from the couch, her eyes fixed on nothing. I packed a bag. Not much, just enough, and watched her from the doorway. She didn't look up. "I'm leaving," I said. No response. I'd taken everything. Her love, her life, her soul. And now I take my absence. It was the cruelest cut, leaving her to live with the ruin I'd made. I didn't go far. Just a motel an hour south. A gray box with peeling paint and a bed that creaked. I needed space to breathe, to let the dust settle on what I'd done. Emily was alone now, trapped in a house that echoed with her failures, surrounded by a life I'd torched. I pictured her there, staring at the walls, the weight of her choices crushing her. It wasn't pity I felt. It was justice, cold and sharp, a blade I'd honed for months. Marcus's fate trickled in through Jake. Tony's handling had been brutal. Marcus was found in an alley, bruised and babbling, his wallet gone, his pride shattered. He checked into a hospital, then disappeared again, a nomad with nothing left. I didn't care where he landed. He'd been a pawn, a tool in Emily's betrayal, and I'd crushed him underfoot. The package I'd sent would find him eventually, a final twist of the knife, but he was irrelevant now. Emily was the heart of this, and I'd ripped it out. I spent the day tying loose ends. I sold our house, quietly through a realtor friend, cutting Emily out of the deal with papers I'd forged months ago. The money went to my new account, a nest egg she'd never touch. I mailed her the deed transfer notice, no explanation, just the fact of it. She'd find it soon, another brick on her chest. I canceled our joint cards, utilities, everything tying us together. She'd wake up to a life unplugged, a husk she couldn't sustain. I thought about confronting her one last time, but I didn't need to. The silence was louder, the abandonment sharper. She'd begged for forgiveness once, and I'd given her ruin instead. I remembered her laugh, her touch, the years we'd built. Gone now, ash in my hands. I didn't regret it. She'd chosen Marcus, chosen to break us, and I'd chosen to break her back. Fair trade, I told myself, though the hollow in my chest said otherwise. That night I drove by the house one last time. The lights were off, the windows dark, a tomb for the woman inside. I didn't stop, just slowed enough to see the sold sign I'd had planted that morning. A final slap she'd feel soon. I kept driving, the road stretching ahead. My life a blank slate I'd write alone. Emily would survive, maybe scraping by, haunted by what she'd lost, but she'd never recover. That was my victory, bitter and complete. I checked my phone. Texts from Jake, updates on Marcus, nothing from her. She wouldn't reach out, not now. She knew I was gone, knew I'd won. I turned off the device, tossed it into the passenger seat, and let the hum of the engine fill the void. The revenge was done, the story over. I'd built it, piece by piece, and now it stood, a monument to her betrayal, a ruin she'd carry forever. Weeks passed, a blur of motels and highways, my life unmoored but free. I settled in a small town up north, a place where no one knew my name, renting a cabin with the sale money. I didn't work, didn't need to yet, just sat by the lake, sketching plans for buildings I'd never build, letting the quiet seep in. Emily's face lingered, a ghost in my mind, but it wasn't love I felt anymore. It was the echo of what I'd done, a shadow I'd cast over her life. I heard about her through Lena, who'd reached out on X, curious despite their rift. "She's not okay," Lena wrote. "Living with her cousin. Barely eating, says she's sorry." I didn't reply. Emily's cousin was a last resort, a cramped apartment in Eugene where she'd be a burden, not a guest. The house was gone, her savings nil, her reputation a stain no one would touch. She'd confessed to Lena, spilled the affair, the guilt, but it hadn't saved her. No one cared enough to pull her up. Marcus surfaced too, a blip in a Sacramento paper. He'd been arrested, drunk and disorderly, ranting about debts and a woman who'd ruined him. The article didn't name Emily, but I knew. He'd hit bottom, a pit I'd dug, and I felt nothing. No triumph, no guilt, just the flat line of closure. The package had reached him, Jake said. Found in his motel room, the photos crumpled, the note torn. He'd know it was me or guess it, but he couldn't touch me now. He was done. I kept tabs, distant but deliberate. Emily's parents had cut her off. Her art scene shunned her. Her world a cage of her own making. The video still circulated, a digital scar she couldn't erase. She tried therapy, Lena said, but quit after 2 sessions, too broken to face it. I pictured her, thin, hollow, staring at walls, and felt the weight of my revenge settle. It wasn't joy, not anymore. It was the end of a blueprint, a structure complete, its purpose served. One night I burned the folder, all the evidence, the plans, the pieces of their betrayal. The flames licked the paper, curling it to ash, and I watched until nothing remained. I didn't need it anymore. The story was written, the punishment delivered. Emily would live, but not really. Trapped in a half-life I'd crafted, every breath a reminder of what she'd lost. Marcus would drift, a wreck on the edges of nowhere, his name forgotten. I stayed by the lake, the water still, my hands empty. The rage was gone, spent in the fire I'd set. I'd loved her once, built a life with her, and she'd torn it down. I'd rebuilt it as vengeance, a cruel, perfect thing, and now it was over. I didn't know what came next, work, maybe, or solitude, but it didn't matter. They were gone, and I was here, the architect of their ruin, standing on the ashes. The story was mine, and I'd ended it my way.